Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to turn the program right away over to our colleague, Afifa Saeed, to begin our afternoon session. Afifa.
Well, like we mentioned before, it's always a tough session after lunch, but I think we have enough to keep us excited just having the President and Mrs. Carter with us in the room. So I'm sure we'll be energetic and activated. I'm also going to start with deep gratitude to both of you for not just calling us to action, but really being the role models to action. Since I was a little girl and I watched the elections and I cried when you didn't win. It wasn't that little, I was about 7 or 8. But just being motivated by the fact that after that, what you've both been able to accomplish has been something that we in our youth and now in our later middle ages now are considering it more than an inspiration. It really is about how to do the work, and that's been a wonderful service to us. And you can tell by the testament to how many people are asking you to fix problems that and some of us, we need help in our houses as well as our countries. So you might have to come over and do some mediation with my kids and I. But that's really a testament to how much we not just love you, admire you, but want to be like you in any way possible. I'm also going to do something. I'm going to start with a prayer. And I know sometimes it's odd, but I get to do it now that I'm no longer with the U.S. government. I had a hard time doing that. The reason I want to start with this is just because we're talking about religion, we're talking about religiosity, and we're also talking about spirituality. And many times when we're in a room full of that much religious, spiritual energy, we do have to call that to play and say, why is it that we sometimes are afraid to just call it out? And the prayer that I want to share actually is one that I have appropriated from our tradition in the Quran, which is a prayer of Prophet Moses when he was asked to be a prophet, when he was actually called to be a prophet. And I use this prayer for almost anything and everything in my life because it makes so much sense to me. It's very simple. It's just, oh dear Lord, expand my chest so that I may breathe easily and so I may be present in my work. Straighten my spine so I may have courage to speak and act in truth. Ease my difficult tasks before me and loosen the knot from my tongue so that I may be understood in all the ways that I communicate. He made this prayer in order to take on the task of being a prophet. In no way do any of us think that we have that put on us, but much of the work that we do in this room and outside of this room every day is called to some sort of a connection to a greater power than us. Now, I think what we want to be able to do in this session is bring some of these pieces together and bring some of these outlying ideas together. And it's as simple as saying, what is this and what is that and how do we bring it together? Because I think a lot of what the conversation has been about has been just everybody saying something and we all agree with it or disagree with it without actually unpacking it a little bit. So what we wanted to do with the session was to talk a little bit more about what is the role of culture and religion in the work that we do, and be a little bit more definitional about it, and be a little bit more confrontational about it in the sense of what do those mean in our own terms and in our own contexts. So I just wanted to bring out maybe 4 things that actually matter in the work that we do that are related to that. And then we're going to really, the bulk of the conversation is for us to hear from those that are in the field that are doing this type of work and that we can react to that. The first thing that's very important is that culture and context do matter. Now, what do we mean by that? We were talking from the first day about the culture of impunity. We're talking about the culture of violence, the culture of this and the culture of that. So as a cultural anthropologist, and I'm so excited we have at least 3 others in this room that I think that are cultural anthropologists, including the translator. She's a cultural anthropologist as well. She wants to make sure she's acknowledged. Between the ways that we look at culture, so just very quickly, culture is not just the sensitivity issues. Culture is not just necessarily in terms of the fine arts and so on and so forth. It's all of that. But in our context here, culture is the geopolitical, the historic, the norms, the traditions, the religion, the identity that a people, a person, and a group hold, right? We all sort of agree to that as a definition. But what's really relevant for us in this conversation, whether it's human rights or development and so on, is the fact that culture inherently, and I say this from an academic perspective, but you all know it, culture is dynamic. And culture changes. And culture is something that can be created, and culture is something that can be destroyed, as we know, but also part of culture, which is identity, which is we have sort of not, I mean, we've talked about it in different ways, but identity itself is created. And then the other thing about identity is it can be imposed on somebody. You may not want to be something that other people are imposing on you, but it is something that can be actionable. Now, why is all of that relevant to what we're talking about? It's relevant because the fact that we can sit sometimes and say, and I've been in high-level policy meetings where we've talked about, okay, fine, we need to know the culture of Afghanistan. So the culture of Afghanistan is X, Y, Z. In fact, I've been at the DOD, I've been at the PRTs as well in Afghanistan, where the soldiers will pull out a card that's about this big, and this is the culture of Afghanistan fitting on this little card, right? It's a really well, very well done piece of paper, but it tells you everything you need to know about Afghanistan on 2 flip sides, right? So people do understand the importance of culture. They do understand why we need to do it, but then the question becomes, well then, how do you actually implement or understand culture in a way that's useful and isn't necessarily destructive? Excuse me. What I also want to focus on is, besides the dynamic nature of culture, besides that it changed, besides all of that and the knowledge we need to have, what's really critical about culture and understanding culture is that many times it does define the aspirations of people. And many times it does frame for us, whether we're inside the culture or outside the culture, how people look at themselves and how people see themselves and how people see what they want to change in their lives and in their communities on their own terms. That's the usefulness of culture. Meaning, if you ask the question, what do you like about where you live or who you are, that's part of their cultural understanding of things. But they also can say, and this is what I really like to see and like to be, and so on. So that's really a critical piece of that. And yes, to acknowledge cultural relativity can be a problem, which means we can say, oh, and I've heard it many times during the last 3 days, we do have people saying, well, it's their culture, therefore we can't touch it, right? I've had people say, well, those people don't value education in their culture, therefore they're not sending their daughters to school, right? So it can be said like that, but then the question becomes, well, did you actually ask them? And did we actually engage with them to understand, yes, that's a value they have, or in fact, is it, and I'll give you an example. In the slums of Karachi, we were there looking at health programs. It's really a pretty terrible place to be and to live. And so we went to look at programs in health, but also the campaign of our offices there at that time was education program, which was in effect the value of education was not being valued. Girls were not going to school, and therefore we had to go and get them to understand the value of education. That was the campaign. So we went there, and we're meeting with elder folks, we're meeting with religious leaders, we're meeting young people, and so on. And so I, at that point, decided to flip the script and instead ask, why aren't you valuing education? I started by asking, well, what's happening right in this community? What's working? And they all looked at me like, you can see nothing is working, everything is broken. And so I kept asking in different ways. I said, well, why do you live here? And why do you stay here? And so finally somebody said, well, we all take care of each other. And then somebody else said, well, we don't let anybody go hungry. We don't let anybody not have shelter. And so they were making a list of all the things that were positive about where they lived, until finally an elderly lady who was also considered a teacher, a religious teacher, stood up and she said, but not enough of our children go to school. And she said that on her own. And then I said, well, why? Why is it that they don't go to school? And she said, not enough of them go to school because too many of them are sick. Okay, why are they, there, so many of them are sick because they go outside and walk in the raw sewage without shoes. So in that conversation, what we started to map was all the development issues and the basic needs issues that were there. But then they also had a solution to the problem. So what was happening in that dynamic was we went in thinking that they didn't value education and that students weren't going to school and they were prevented, especially the girls, et cetera, the narrative was set. But with this script and this conversation, it became clear that it's not even an issue of value, and it's not even an issue of how they want to interact with it, but it's really an issue of how we ask the question and how they come to the conclusion. So I wanted to share that with you just in terms of the context of values. So what I would like to shift us to now, and this is what I've asked the speakers to talk about, is what is going on within cultures that is dynamic, and why is that relevant to our conversation? And the reason I wanted to say that was because there is, within culture, it can be something that's changing from outside. So you have people that are displaced. You have generations that are in IDP camps, or a generation that's in IDP camp that can't transmit the culture to their young people. And so they don't learn how to farm in the same way. They don't learn how to preserve food or do any kind of things that they would do in their own homes. So you lose some things in that process. That's an outside influence. But the inside influences are also really critical. And what we want to focus on today in this conversation is the dynamics of culture and religion. How are they reflected in the internal reforms that are going on? And what are those internal reforms? And how can we identify those internal reforms? So it's not just a matter of these religious leaders have never, do not, and will never engage on these issues that we need them to. Why can we say that that's changing? So reform can be a shock to the system. And an example is, in the U.S., we've had an issue with many Muslim women feeling that they are not represented, and therefore they want to be leaders of prayers themselves. So they've created their own structure for that. In some ways, that's been a shock to the system because they've been women-led prayers, and it creates an issue of its own. But then we have also had, for the last 30 years, women within mosques working with boards and working with leadership inside and building the issue of women within and being an inclusive mosque and having actual leadership positions and having actual leadership decision making. And so that's been a little bit more long-term, obviously. It's been something that's been very slow, but it's been affecting the way that mosques in the U.S. actually operate. For myself to be able to write a sermon, and I've written many sermons for my imams to give as a Muslim woman, has been more effective for me in my personal capacity than to actually lead a prayer and say a sermon, because all those folks that are in that congregation would not have listened to me necessarily, but the message that I can get across about anything that needs to be is gotten across from the sermon. So that's just an example of how that kind of reform or that kind of effect can take place within that context. But it is long-term, and it is something that takes time. But I do want to say that I think, especially in the Muslim context, but I think in most religious contexts now, reformation is taking place across the board. It's not as stagnant as many people would like to think, only because we're not able to count that reform or understand that reform on our terms. And it's happening in a way that, I know that 3-4 years ago, before the revolution, there was a really interesting paper, and then we had there was a discussion on the role of women within Islamist movements. And these were written by women within those movements. And they had spelled out what they needed to see different, and so on and so forth. But it didn't make headlines. It didn't make, it didn't get out very much farther. But the fact was these were conversations already happening. And are we able to tap into those conversations? We have had now, in terms of the Quran, translations by feminist women with a feminist perspective. We've had the most commonly accepted and understood translation of the Quran in English has been by a non-Arab and by a person who was more in love with Shakespeare and with the great books then he was considered a religious scholar. But his translation is so on point in terms of how it relates to our life that it's the #1 best-selling Quran in the world, which is pretty interesting in terms of how that speaks to people. In the interconnectedness and the access to scripture and the access to people's interpretations and so on, there's just so little space now for stagnation, because it's almost like there's no excuse but to change and but to move on. And so it's been something that I think, I'm excited about as part of the community in my faith, but I'm also seeing it across faiths as well. So we want to just call that out, and we want to look for those intersections rather than think they're not existing at all. And I want to, in terms of that piece, I would just want to stop by saying that in this interconnected world, there's so much access to spirituality and connection that it's become more and more personal than it has ever been. Meaning people are interpreting and understanding and accepting religiosity on their own terms than I think they ever have. Because of this, you can sit and have a Friday prayer on YouTube by yourself, and you can choose who you want to listen to. In many cases, not in terms of accessibility, that really turns it up a few notches in terms of access, right? So for me, it's very clear that the extremists, it seems like more and more exist or more are common, but I feel that the more they're existing in such an out loud way because they are realizing that in fact more and more of the populations in any of these religious faiths are more tempered and are more connected than they have before. And so extremists have to make much more noise about it because that's upsetting them. So the second thing that matters is definition and language, and how we define and what language we use. I know this is something we're all very aware of in the field, but I just want to remind us. So we were having a discussion about gender equality, and many people are instead much more interested in the idea of gender justice, because justice speaks to many more you could say non-Western, but other understandings of what we're trying to get out of equality than equality itself does. Sounds like a simple or not a big idea in itself, but it does speak to how we use these terms. Empowerment itself has become an issue for many people. So instead of saying empowerment, what are we really trying to say? We're trying to say accountability, transparency, participation. So let's use those words instead that are also more translatable. And obviously the labeling is problematic in and of itself. The third thing that I wanted to make sure that we have on the table that we've already talked about many different ways is engagement with what already exists. And then who does the engagement is extremely critical. It does matter who stands in the room and tries to get religious leaders to listen. I've walked into rooms, and this was in Northwest Frontier in Pakistan. I walked into a room of madrasa heads, and collectively they represent hundreds, if not thousands, tens of thousands of children, because they have all these madrasas under them. So I walked into the room to talk about peace education, and they all turned their chairs and wouldn't look at me. And my colleagues who are Americans said, this is offensive. We need to leave this room. We need to, why are we here? They're not even listening to us. I said, let's just hold on and see what happens. Because the fact was they didn't leave. They were still in the room. So as we started to talk and just ignored the dynamics, one of them turned his chair around. And then as we kept talking, they all started to turn their chairs around. We didn't make eye contact, but they didn't leave the room. And they did interact with us. So a simple example of how you do the engagement and how you respond to it is I think, it has become more and more critical. And the authenticity too. Sorry, I'm going fast also. The authenticity and who we look for. We also have mentioned this many times. Who are the leaders or who are the actors we're looking for? It does take time, but that time spent on trying to find out who we're engaging and why we're engaging them is much more, in the end of the day, is going to give us much more bang for our buck, if you want, than just picking those people that come to us immediately and think that we will engage with them only. So finally, part of engagement is recognizing what's right and asking that same question, what's working in your community? And you'll find many more people ready and able to interact than if you ask, well, I should say, it's much easier for people to respond to what's the problem than what's right. Many people have in their back pockets a list of what's wrong. because they're much more conditioned to that. But if we ask what's right and what is happening even in the religious space that's right, I think we get much, much farther. And then, of course, role models are going to be very important as well in that. Okay, so we're going to, a lot of these themes are going to come up in what you'll hear now from the other speakers that we have. And what I've asked them to do is sort of hone in on what their experience has been that reflects some of this, and then also expand from that a little bit. And so, in terms of how we connect both the theory and the understanding of this work to the actual practical implementation is going to be very critical. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Fakhiyuddin Abdul Qadir, who is working with religious leaders in Southeast Asia on their own capacity. And he's bringing in individuals, and especially women, into the religious interpretation model. So I think if you can give us a sense of, really how you do this and how it works and how it's sustainable, it might give us ideas for the rest of our context as well.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum, shalom, good afternoon. My name is Fakih from Indonesia. I work with the Fahmina Foundation, that works for empowerment of people using the religious lens of pluralism, democracy, and gender justice. About the experience that I have, I would like, first of all, to highlight that everything in my experience has two phases, and maybe more than two phases. So the core is how to approach to it, not about it itself, including religion and belief. So here I agree totally with the invitation of the Mr. President on how to mobilize the religion and belief in order to enhance women's rights and to protect them from violence. But my agreement is not from political point of view or strategy like Marwa might be said. I think this is from the point of view of religion also and spirituality. I mean, this is the obligation of religion. I'm coming from Islamic boarding school, and in my experience, I can say that the engagement of religious leaders in terms of advocating gender justice and preventing women from violence, it works in Indonesian context. But of course, the term of religious leaders should be not understood as static as maybe found in Iran or Egypt, because in Indonesia more moving this kind. There is no formal institution that produce religious. There is no formal institution that produce religious leaders. So I mean, maybe this is the difference. So in Indonesia, generally, we can say that many issues of gender justice, when interrupted by a certain religious interpretation and blocked by them using the religious interpretation, we can find in Indonesia other religious leaders who sit and support and defend for that issue of gender justice. So now in Indonesia, for example, we have this kind of leaders using religious lens in many levels, national and local, and in the parliament, executive, and also in National Commission of Violence Against Women, and even National Commission of Human Rights. And these leaders coming to that kind of office not to overrule the perspective, but to work hand in hand and together to foster the perspective of gender justice. And if you know that Indonesia also can be recognized as successful in terms of family planning, also because of effort of religious leaders. So in Indonesia, we have law to eradicate all violence against women, also because of religious leaders, because the debate in the public always using religion to interrupt this law. So it is the task of other alternative interpretation using religion to defend that law, and now law become our positive law. this is what we have in Indonesia. But I don't want to say that everything become, of course, successful because you know that gender dynamic is still, even in America, who has more better education, better economy, still gender violence very, very much. I mean, there are still problems, but at least in the country that religion become very powerful, we have certain religious leaders who can support us and become our defender for the advocacy of gender justice. And the question how, when Afifa said, how is it happen? And Marwa also, why in Indonesia works but doesn't work in other? I don't know, because I'm not sociologist and I'm not also anthropologist, but I just want to tell about my experience maybe. This kind of, let's say, project of bringing religious leaders to come to that awareness, using many multiple strategy aspect, and we start, for example, with finding the most powerful authority. I mean, if we don't get that kind of people, men or women, and then we try to find the second layer. I mean, the son or daughter of religious leaders. But at least the traditional authority will not prevent us doing that kind of training or project. So let us do that project. But not only because this one, because we have a partnership also with government, Islamic University. In Indonesia, as you know, each Islamic university has Center for Women Study, led by women, using gender perspective, and doing that kind of interpretation to relatively many aspects of interpretation. So in Indonesia, we have curriculum based on gender justice. We have, let's say, reference of Islamic books, Quran, Hadith, and many things written by those who has authority in this aspect. So many things we will try to convince that at least when we bring them, when ask them, I mean religious leaders, to come to the fore, to the table like this, we start not about religious interpretation, but we start with the lived realities of women. So we try to convince them that these problems, these realities, is the real problem. This is the starting point, and then when they are convinced about this problem, we start to bring them into the principle of religion, which is justice. And after that, let them to interpret the religion. So in this kind, I agree that interpretation really much more personal. So we need that. We just need that like encouragement. So when we encourage people to interpret using the belief of justice, I think we will have many interpretation based on that justice to advocate and the gender and to prevent the violence based gender. And in this aspect, I can say that in Indonesia there are many creative interpretation to religion done by women and men in order to foster the perspective of gender justice and also to prevent violence against girls and women in many aspects. So and we use many strategy also in terms of religion, like we use song also. We use religious song like solawat. We call solawat keadilan. I mean equality or solawat of justice. But the activists say this is solawat of gender or song of gender. And we have community-based radio. We have also leaflet and for Friday sermons each week, of course, spread out among the people. Of course, people then have alternatives, not only one interpretation, which is maybe very problematic in terms of this agenda. But if government and Islamic organization and people also have at least two alternatives. One is not with us, other with us, so people have choice to do. So I think the problem in my experience is how to maintain this kind of interpretation, because the well-funded growing fundamentalism across the world, not only Indonesia, is challenging. So when I try to put it into, let's say, to experience which one is discouraging and which one is encouraging in terms of religious interpretation to advocate gender justice, I can say that maybe the most discouraging for this kind of project is they have easy understanding using literal interpretation. So we know that in our religion, in Islam, there are many texts, verses, and hadiths, if understood literally, become problem from us. So this is can found many verses and many hadiths. And also we have formal institution that generally not with us. And politic of morality of public also, generally not with us. I mean, and of course the context of male domination of worldwide and interest. This is the most challenging. For us. And the last maybe is like global fundamentalism and capitalism. While what that encourage us in terms of fostering this kind of religious interpretation, I can say that we have better analysis and data in terms of lived relatives of women facing a problem of gender violence. We can use it among religious leaders to understand well about this kind of realities. And we should not also growing religious feminism is very good for us in Indonesian context, and not only in Indonesia, I think, in many, even maybe rejected in Egypt, but at least people can read and can use it for their own personal religious experience.
Thank you, Faki. That's
Okay.
a very good overview, and I think maybe as we discuss, we'll get to some more of the details.
Okay.
And I think you're speaking to an important issue, which is many times religious leaders feel instrumentalized and used just for messages that we want them to give, and we get frustrated that they don't give our messages. So what you're trying to do, it seems, is much more have them be part of the process of education, part of the process of awareness, so they themselves take ownership of the issues and the messages as well. And that's something we've seen across the board has been very impactful in how we engage them. Mubin, can we move to you? And Mubin Sheikh has a very interesting bio that everyone can read. But I think what makes it really important for your contribution here is to talk about how we do go from reform from within, and we look at extremism. And so the question to you really is, as you actually engage with extremists, is there a narrative, is there a dialogue, is there a way through in terms of that reform within narrative that we can both see, quantify in some way, but also share so other people understand, well, this is a way to engage them that will bring them down from that space that they're in. So if you can give us a little bit of that, and also the how, because I think we know the what, we really are concerned about how, so we can put that into play as well in our own work.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Peace and blessings be upon all of you without equivocation, prejudice, reservation. I quote the Christ Jesus, son of Mary, peace and blessings of God be upon both of them, when he recited the Shema Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. The Lord our God is one God. One God, one love. Love is the answer, right? So what I'm going to do is just start with framework for changes, framework for changing learned behavior, especially with regards to agents of social change. Because all of us come from different backgrounds, different approaches. Some of us, I will slow down already, I'm hearing. Some of us have had access to education in places that have very high levels of education, and so we may have progressed intellectually a little bit faster than other places where education is not available to people. So it becomes difficult for us to try to impose onto people who are not yet at that stage views that we hold after our own intellectual journeys, and we've come to this very nice place, and we want everyone to think like us. The reality is that not everyone moves at the pace that we move at. If you spoke to me when I was 21 years old, I didn't want to talk to people like you. I was deeply engrossed in extremist ideology. I became radicalized when I was 19 years old. You couldn't tell me any of the things that I'm hearing today. I would have closed my ears to them. But it took time for me to get to a point where I could actually open my eyes and open my ears and open my heart so that these messages started to receive. So I just have 5 quick points. They are quick. Number 1, anything that you try to do must resonate with the sacred values of the people that you're talking to. You cannot come to them with values that they reject. Maybe you want them to accept those values eventually, but at the moment, if they don't accept them, you must operate in the environment that they are comfortable with. Number 2, to understand that people are products of the societies in which they live, and they may have gone through conditioning in the context of abusive authoritarian regimes. So again, pace of change. They may not understand when we come from our perspective. They can't fathom this. Number 3, and my father always says this to me, generally speaking, there's no such thing as overnight change. Just like radicalization is not an instant overnight process, de-radicalization, and I'm very involved with this, is not an overnight simple quick process. You're dealing with learned behaviors. To try to change learned behaviors, somebody's been doing something for 25 years, 40 years, you're not going to change that in a week, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years. And number 4, extremists are being challenged by men and women. And it bothers me when people say, Muslims are not speaking out enough. I think people are not listening enough. Many times I have seen Muslims speaking out, but they don't get the media. 2 guys go somewhere, they yell against, America, the Jews, and they're experts on Islam, and they're on every TV show, certain news channels, Fox. And number 5, things are getting better. Look where we were 70 years ago. We were kind of taking the UN to task in our workshops. But look where we are 70 years after. Where were we 70 years ago? Could we have conversations like this with the kind of people that are here? No. So things have changed a lot. And just to directly speak to the point of what works in this context, I do deal with ISIS extremists online, actual members of ISIS, sympathizers of ISIS. I have been chatting with a 19-year-old kid from Finland. He's white. He doesn't know any Arabic, but he is a diehard supporter of ISIS. It took me a year and a half just to gain his trust to have a face-to-face Skype conversation with him. After engaging him, I got him to publicly denounce Al-Shabaab after the attacks at the Westgate Mall in Kenya. It took a long time, and to build trust is very, very difficult. Even for me, I'll admit, because I used to be a counterterrorism operative, security intelligence, counterterrorism. When they hear that I come from that side, I am the worst thing to them. I am an apostate as far as they're concerned. I'm out of the religion. I get death threats from them saying, you know, we would love to cut your head off and put it on YouTube. These are the kinds of things that you have to deal with. People say to me, you're so brave, you're so brave. I'm not brave. I live in the West. I have, you know, people who protect me. But I hear stories about people who are working in remote villages that we never hear about. I never heard about until I came here, who are doing the work quietly, professionally, under even more threat. So, final point, just to be cognizant, to be aware that it takes time. Change does take time, and eventually it will occur. Thank you.
Mubin and I were joking about how the idea of time, I mean, you could be an extremist in your life, you can also be an extremist during the day. And you can be an extremist in something and just shift. And the idea that you are shifting identities for different reasons, and it can come to play in your own life on a regular basis. And that's the trouble with putting people in boxes. As soon as they're an extremist and forever an extremist, it's just not true. And a conservative and so on and so forth. So it becomes problematic. We're going to move now to Ala Murabit, who is from, you heard her having a shout out this morning from Gaynor, from Libya, and really representing a really interesting space right now because it's transitioning, it's in conflict, it's war, but we were also talking about what was it like before and how does the transition itself speak to the work itself and how does it affect. So Anna, if you can give us a sense of your work, which is with women, but you've been specifically looking at engaging religious leaders obviously on women's issues, but also overall for the betterment of the country. And you're in a space where you're actually building something, the country itself from the space that it was in before. So if you can give us a sense again of how you're doing it and what are some principles that we should maybe keep in mind.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for having me, first off. I'll actually start with something that my lovely father said, since he was already mentioned. When I was much younger, I know it's hard to believe, but I was a bit of a misbehaving child. And I expected to get yelled at by my parents. So I ran upstairs to the washroom and I locked the door, you know, I was just terrified. And my dad came upstairs and he sat me down and I said, you know, I'm so sorry I'm being so bad. And my dad said, no, you're not a bad person. You're not. You made one mistake. You're forgiven. And years later, I asked him about it because every time I wanted to do something wrong, I would think of my dad coming upstairs and telling me I was a good kid and he was proud of me. And he told me, if you think someone is a black sheep, they become a black sheep. And he said, any parent will tell you that. If you think your kid is a liar, your kid will start lying to you. If that's how you treat them, that's how they become. And when we started working on women, peace, and security in Libya, I kept hearing, particularly from the international community, from other Libyan women, don't involve religious leaders. They will not support us. They will close the door in our face. They do not like women. They do not support women. And the fact of the matter was that in that arena, the most powerful people were the religious and cultural leaders. So I was either not part of the conversation, trying to invent a conversation that the locals did not understand, or I was going to start talking to religious leaders. So I employed my dad's belief of, if you think somebody is a black sheep, they will be, and started talking to them the way I speak to my father, with the expectation that they will support me, with the expectation that my faith supports me. So our organization created local city teams of people who live in those communities and know these religious leaders on a personal basis and have expectations, right? To go to schools and mosques and conduct seminars and surveys, and it became the largest campaign in Libyan history, civil society or government. And the idea really was to take these verses from the Quran, to take these hadiths, and to take the influence, this already traditional established influence of religious leaders, and utilize it to ensure that the goodness, I guess, of some aspects of this faith, in particular to women, was highlighted. And so that was kind of where we focused on. And it was really about going and saying, you know, we know that you agree with us and we expect you to do this. Like you're the person we need to speak out about this, and not really entertaining the thought that we couldn't. So.
Thank you. In some ways, it's be the change you want to see, and create it in terms of what's in front of you. Before we go and open up the mics to everybody, we're going to have our last speaker, and I saved her for last, especially because I think Sheikha Ruqayya represents almost everything that we've been talking about here. She is a religious scholar. She is a traditional leader. She has been working on women's rights, women's issues, but also religiosity for 50 years. So she knows what she's talking about. But also because, again, the way that we started with the sense of religiosity and the sense of spirituality, she brings that with her in her own being. So I've asked her to say a few things to us, and it was just interesting. Her son told me that she's been doing this for 50 years, but she came here and she's saying thank you to all of us, just so that she can learn from us. So that tells you that sense of humility, which is what a true spiritual inspiration is about. So we'll turn it over to her. And she will be speaking in Arabic, so you might want to get your headsets ready.
I thank God, Sayyid al-Rais Jimmy Carter, السيدة يوسف، السادة الحاضرين في السادة سكان مدينة أتلانتا. So people of Atlanta, please allow me to thank you. Can you hear me? I have seen at the end of the 50s of last century that education was the best thing for changing concepts, and it is possible for men and women and look into. So we need to put a stop to domestic violence and violence in general, like our girls in Nigeria. Some people believe that this kind of violence against women is a sunnah, that is the tradition of the Prophet, and therefore I call on millions of Muslims and all sectors of society to confront this phenomenon, this destructive behavior that leads to destruction, and we should cooperate to put an end to the violations of human rights and help in supporting education in order to improve women's status. And in my experience, I was alone in this struggle in my homeland, which made me emigrate to Ghana, and then in 1958, before the independence of Senegal. And that was still under colonization. And then I was welcomed in Ghana, and I was welcomed because there are many Muslims, and in conclusion, and hoping that your hospitality or your welcome to this forum will help in highlighting the subject that we care for. We wish you success and thank you and goodbye.
I have also asked her to make a prayer for us at some point, so whenever she's ready, she'll do that.
In the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful, many thanks and gratitude to God, the most compassionate. In your name, we call for help to reach the rightful path and to show us the right path. We are all in all situations under your protection, and we hope that you can give us the ability to give charity and that you take care of us and give us blessed children, and no one can give me a better reward than yourself. Oh, God, make the heavens a paradise my last abode. God, bless our Prophet Muhammad, the last of the prophets, and we pray that you lead us to your rightful path. Thank you, God.
Barakallahu fiki. Thank you. We're going to move from our sheikha to another sheikha, which is Reverend Gibord. You've had your tent up for a while, and we thought this would be a good transition from one sheikha to another.
I'm Gwen Gibord, aka Sheikha. I'm very honored by that title. Thank you so much. I'm an Episcopal priest in another life out of the Diocese of Los Angeles and the president of the Gibord Center, Religion Inside Out. I want to kind of reframe some of our conversation that we've had by saying this. Religious leaders all too frequently are actually blessing violence against women and girls by our silence, both in the pulpit and when things happen, not only nationally but internationally, and we say nothing. Much has been said, particularly in the past day, about moving from fear to confidence. Now, I'm aware that there are many people who have come to identify with the oppressor. And I too believe, as my brother mentioned to the left of me, that behavior is learned. If behavior is learned, it can be unlearned. And rather than identifying as people of faith with the oppressor, we would do better to identify with the peacemakers. The Buddha, Krishnamurti, Swami Vivekananda, Jesus Christ, Muhammad, blessed be his memory. Not one of these prophets or religious leaders ever killed another human being. Not one of these prophets or religious leaders ever tortured another human being or imprisoned another human being. And we must shift the identity away from the oppressor to the peacemaker. I believe that social media can take a tremendous and positive role in this. And I want to encourage us, particularly this is true in the United States, where there are those progressive religious leaders, whether they are imams, rabbis, priests, ministers, etc. Not that this doesn't happen in other countries. I want to be clear with that. To share with the Carter Center those sermons that we hear that can be used as models for people all over the world when it comes to an inclusive interpretation of our holy and sacred texts. And I also want to encourage us to cross the aisle. meaning that we have to bring, I would encourage us, we don't have to do anything, but I want to encourage us to bring to this table those folks who may be Pentecostal or evangelical, fundamentalist in any way, to encourage them to have the conversation with us. It will take time. We have time. It will take patience. We have patience. And it will take an unending amount of goodwill. But as long as we continue to hearken back to the teachings of the Buddha, the teachings of Jesus Christ, the teachings of Krishnamurti and of Muhammad, blessed be his memory, the teachings of, not the interpretation of, we will, with time and goodwill with one another, get to where we want to get. It will take time. Thank you.
The recurring theme of the religious self, which is time. And like you said, that's what we have. And that's what we are accountable for in the end of the day, is how we use our time as well. I'm going to keep on our stretch of our esteemed spiritual leaders and move to Reverend Timothy, who had his card up.
Timothy Nijoya.
Yes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very grateful to be with this August gathering. It offers me a platform to bounce my ideas and also learn from other people's ideas. In the morning, I wanted to say that the speeches by the president of the Commissioner for Human Rights and the president did a lot, cover a lot about the areas we should cover for fighting for the good of humankind, and humankind, including women and men. But they didn't say that rape and the HIV, and especially HIV and female circumcision, they didn't mention those tools of violence or instruments of violence by men against women, especially against girls. From Cape Town to Cairo, and from Somalia to West Africa, there is one kasha of reducing women to property by processing them to become wives, and processing them like in a factory to become mothers, and the processing is done through circumcision. So women are processed to become property through circumcision. And you know, most of those kashas have been to Ghana, to Nigeria, even to Tunisia and to South Africa. In most of those kashas where women are circumcised, they are processed from raw material into property. An uncircumcised woman is a raw material. No value at all. When she gets circumcised, she becomes sellable by the father, what I also call intramasculine trade, by the father to a young man. She's not involved in the negotiation of her value, neither the mother. The girl is made property. So the buyer, if she doesn't get pregnant, can return her and get dowry back. Not only that, the buyer can not return, can discipline her. But discipline is actually torture. And the buyer can add her value by marrying more women in the same trade manner. So in Kenya, right now, from Christmas, girls have been undergoing circumcision by thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. Yet the law and the Constitution prohibits circumcision, yet they are being circumcised because certain customs, men don't know how to own women without being circumcised. It is taboo to sleep with a woman who is not circumcised. And all those things require education, not academic, because some of those men are MPs, members of parliament, and they are educated. A different kind of conscientization, a kind of education like this one we have been undergoing there. I wish half of us were liberated like me, who came here, and half of us were oppressors. So they can have a different view of the world and a different view of thinking. And I think we need to transform and interact with other men who are not like me and who are not like Jim Carter. Because there are many. And I am very happy. The last time I was here, we went to see Bush. We had a communication to take it to Washington. And I was very happy that Jim Carter knew that there are presidents who are not like him, whom he could influence. And I think we need to take at our own level how to influence those people. So as I was saying, there are many instruments of ownership and control of women, not simply circumcision, but HIV/AIDS is a tool of control, because when a man marries 10 wives, he ends up killing all of them by transmitting HIV from one to the other one. And I think next time we should remember Africa, where HIV is prevalent, and especially in East Africa, and it is used as a tool of control. The other way, it was mentioned here that the sex is also a tool of war. It's an instrument of war for dominance. I was just mentioning those. Me, I'm mentioned as Timothy Joya. I was born in 1941 by a mother who had refused to be circumcised in 1925. And in 1936, married and refused to be dowarized. She refused to be paid dowry for. She said, she told the clan of my father, I'm not a goat to be bought. So she got married without being bought. So I'm 100% like my mother. In fact, tell Kenyans I'm a woman. Because I inherited that tradition of egalitarianism, of self-determination, not for my own sake, because when my mother refused to be circumcised, and she succeeded and became a teacher, the first teacher with a teaching certificate, P4, almost all girls in her area refused to be circumcised. In my district, there's no circumcision anymore, just because of one woman. And I know because of myself alone, and that's why I'm saying I'm a woman, because I replicate my mother, I incarnate her, even though physically I'm like my father. In 1986, we were struggling for the equality of men and women. It wasn't possible because the laws, which are old, men give, fathers still, this trade goes in the church. A father is asked who is going to give this woman to the man. And it's not the mother. The father says, I. And the girl is married. So even this trade goes through weddings in the church. And I was trying to fight that against that in my church. So I succeeded. The other churches continued with that liturgical trade in the church. Now, what I'm trying to say is that we need to deconstruct masculinity. So in 1999, I set an organization called Men for the Equality of Men and Women, a national one. Thanks to Ford Foundation, we got an initial grant of $250,000 in order to be able to go to schools, in order to organize churches, and we have really to organize mosques And really, many mosques in Kenya now do endorse the equality of men and women through this program. Now it has been going on since 1989 we started, 99, but 2004 to now, the organization has really gained a lot of momentum. So, and we have done this through constitution, demonstrations, picketing. If you saw my resume before, I've been killed 3 times. I've been in ICU 3 times for being brutalized and killed by the police for advocating, especially for the equality of men and women, and for a constitution that advocates for equality. Our constitution now is the best, but they are rolling. It is being rolled back by the parliament. And this is where the struggle is, because they have slipped backwards or brought in that African traditional men marry many wives, and they have enacted a bill unconstitutionally which allows Kenyan men to have as many wives as possible. So we have 4 parallel kinds of marriages now: Muslim, Christian, Hindu, and traditional. All I wanted to mention is that we can. You don't need to be many. I like my brother who was talking here, who was radicalized and de-radicalized. For me, I'm still radical. I don't know other way, because you talk of tradition. Radicalism has become my tradition. In that, I'm a man, but again, I do embody and feel. I do replicate female. And it's true, because I have only 4 daughters, and they all have PhDs. And they are all great leaders. And I told them, you are made in God's image, and you are complete within yourself and self-sufficient. You don't have to be a wife or to be married. Fortunately, the 2 have got are looking for husbands. But not because it is a definition of a woman. A woman is not defined by motherhood or wifehood. She is complete in herself as a human being. And this is what I taught my daughters. Since I can say a lot, let me shut up.
So you're a radical woman preacher. That's how we got what we got out of this. Yeah, and I think the term radical has been co-opted, because radical social justice workers, radical peace activists, why not? And why would we let them take it from us and use it in a way that we're not happy with? But radicalism is something that we're all hoping to be a part of in the positive way. You also bring up a very important point about building the capacity of religious leaders in these issues. And this is something we've been trying to do consistently I was doing it at USAID, but other work as well, which was to really build the capacity of religious leaders to understand the issues at all. And many of them aren't in that space because they're working in their religious space, but then for them to understand what the status is of HIV/AIDS in their country, what the status is of child marriage, and so on and so forth. We had a situation in Mali at one point. We were working on a maternal health program, and we brought the religious leaders together to talk about how many women were dying during childbirth. And one of the religious leaders, the imam, said, "Oh, but that's okay, because the Prophet says that if you're giving birth and you die, you go straight, you're a martyr, you go to heaven," which is an actual true saying of the Prophet, because childbirth is so important that if you die during it, it is as if you were in battle, so you go to heaven. So we were a little bit worried about it, because that would stop all the programs then. But another religious leader sitting across from him said, "Oh, that's true, but you know what? There's another saying of the Prophet where he says that paradise lies at the feet of the mother," which is a saying of the Prophet. And so they took it out, these two sayings, and they just started to discuss them, and the second one won over the first one, which was to say, if paradise is at the feet of the mother, that's kind of a big deal. And if it's so much that she's going to die and go to heaven, that's sort of a big deal. So they were able to work it through, but what was important, and this is why I appreciate your point, Reverend, is that it was that they understood that so many women were dying during childbirth, that it made them look at these scriptures in a different way, and not just use them as their sermons. So it was really interesting how they reconnected on that. Yeah, I was just going to call on Sharifa. Okay. Yep, we had a list here that we were trying to make sure we cover everybody. Michael, did you want to jump in at this point, or do you want to save it for? I think I'll save it for okay. Okay. So, Seema, can we go ahead with you, because I know you've had your tent up for a while.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the President Carter to give us the possibility to be together with a lot of, let's say, radical people. And I claim to be radical also. I think, I'm just talking about our experience in Afghanistan. We have to be very careful how do we engage the religious leaders, because we have Ulama Council in Afghanistan, which has been used by the leadership as a political tool when they want to use them. So what was happened, we went to the president, the previous one, to Karzai with some cases of violence against women. And we took a lot of photographs because we were thinking that he's very emotional, so we could encourage him to take some action by seeing the photos. So we went to him and he said, oh, it's really horrible and it's really bad. Let's engage Ulama Council. So he asked us to come on Friday, because each Friday at the end of the month, he was organizing a lunch with the Ulama Council. Then, of course, a lot of us, we said, okay, yes, but I was among the one who said, I'm afraid that we should not be engaged with them before doing some homeworks, before preparing ourselves. Anyway, 10 of us, I mean, I didn't go, but the rest of our colleague, 10 of them went to see to be with the Ulama Council during the lunch with the president. Of course, that day, the head of the Ulama Council stand up and said, oh, it's really horrible, we should do something and we should work with it. And then finally they decided that we should have a conference of ulama and women's rights activists together in order to talk about the elimination of violence against women. I was telling our colleague, the women's rights activists, that we should be cautious because we should not give the stage and microphone to them to use it against us. And then they were asking for that they will choose a topic and they will choose a speaker. And we were insisting that no, we want this, we will choose a speaker and we will choose the topic. So finally we were not agreed. And then in the next month, lunchtime, the Ulama Council came with a statement saying that women are made of the lift rib of men, so they are not complete. And it came in the media, and it was said in front of the president. So our president was also somehow saying yes to the overall comment of the head of the Ulama Council. The reason I'm saying this is that we have to be careful how we choose and when we choose. The other example is that we have the elimination of violence against women law in Afghanistan, which we actually pushed the previous president, and somehow we exploit him. Before going for election, we said if he can get something out of him in order to encourage women to vote for him or to participate on the election. So he signed a decree passing the elimination of violence against women. When it gone to the parliament, of course, some of the women in the parliament, they wanted to use it as a tool for their own personal interest. And then the environment was not ready. As soon as she took it to the parliament, and the few religious leaders, they claim that they are religious leaders, they are mullahs, and they stand up against and said it is against Islam, and then we couldn't pass the law. And they specifically choose few articles. One is polygamy, that in the law it claims that they cannot marry another second or third wife unless the first one or two or three has agreed to the new marriages. They said it's against Islam. Islam gives us the right to have 4 wives. The second one was that the age of the marriage, because in the law, the age of the marriage is 16 years, but they were insisting that no, the Prophet wife, Bibi Aisha, was married when she was 9 years old. So the father has the right to give to the marriage, whatever is the age. So the reason I'm saying is that, again, we have to be really, really careful when and how we are choosing to be engaged with whom of the religious leader, not the one who are used politically. The other issue that I want to raise is that if we have a good law and push for law enforcement, then that may be the right tool to use. And I insist on the proper education and inclusion of human rights and equality and human rights values and principles in the curriculum of the schools from the beginning up to the higher education, rather than, I think that will be alternative to radicalization of madrasas and so on. The other example from Afghanistan is also, unfortunately, the madrasas, which was somehow also supported by the USAID, I would say, because our Minister of Education was saying that we need to build madrasas in Afghanistan in order to prevent our children to go to Pakistan because they become radical, too radical, or right radical, I would say, not left radical. And then everybody really jumped in. But we were resisting, we were saying that no, whatever madrasas that we have in Afghanistan, we don't know exactly how many madrasas we have because Saudi is supporting, even Sudan is supporting some, and Iran is supporting some. So we said no, control the one which we already have. At least register them and see what they are really teaching. But nobody listened, actually. And they give a lot of money and establish new madrasas. And what's happening now, the madrasa which is established even for the girls in the north of Afghanistan, the girls are so radical, they're not allowing their family member to watch television. They're covering their face from their ankles. So it is really important that how we educate them on religious. And it does require a strong political will and maybe somehow control what they teach. So I think we have to be cautious. We have to look at the issues. Again, we go back to our own culture and tradition and our own geography rather than tradition and culture, which is sometimes it's very, has very negative impact on women's issues. So I would just raise this issue from our own experience in Afghanistan. So we have to be very, very careful just to jump on building religious school or madrasas, and then we will not be able to control them. Unfortunately, we have this kind of so-called, I mean, in Afghanistan, for example, we never had this black style of hijab, but currently it's just coming with all these madrasas, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. Just you were bringing up USAID. Just a quick note I wanted to say was that while we were there looking at these issues, one of the things we did was put together a study on if we do actually work with religious institutions, not just madrasas, but religious institutions, what does it do? And the studies show that if we actually build capacity of these local institutions, like mosques and local judges and so on, if you build their capacity to do their work well, and also give them an understanding of constitutional law and so on and so forth, it actually affects positively the government and the federal systems. So we were able to actually show that as a correlation in response to this issue about can't we just ignore the religious? If we just ignore them, they'll go away. The fact is they're not going to go away because more people use them than they do the other systems. And so if we just build their capacity to do even their work better, it showed that a religious judge, if he has understood the constitutional law and everything else, when somebody comes to him for a dispute and he can say, you know, I can't handle that dispute, and he'll say, go to the federal system instead. And we saw the uptick once we did that capacity building for them. So that's an interesting correlation to say that we can't ignore them, but the way that we engage them and on what we engage is going to be just as important as engaging them or not engaging them. So I think those kinds of studies, and we were talking about earlier about evidence and case studies and so on, those are going to be very important for us to pull together. I think we have time maybe for one more, and I know Sharifa, you had your tent up for a while, and I wanted to make sure we heard from you if you still wanted to speak.
I am Sharifa. I am coming from south part of India. Last 25 years I am working on gender issues. Last 10 years particularly I am working on Muslim women issues. Because this Muslim women sector is very much denied from all other sections of the society. Not only the religious institutions, the state, the government, even I can say even some human rights organization also. Because in a national, international level, the Muslim identity is, everybody knows it is, Muslim means it's a terrorist. This is the, everybody facing, me, myself. If anything happened in any place, it is every place the Muslim people are violating by the state. And second thing is, within the religion, the Muslim women are very much dominating by the religious community. Sometimes the state also is silent because the states don't want to lose the Muslim men votes. That's why life is very much, actually they curbed their life. Even if I have any problem with my husband, even if I go to the police station is denied to take my issues. The police says, you have your own Jamaat, you have your own religious community, you go there. Okay, if I go there, the religious people says, they will call my husband, they are sitting inside of the mosque. They call Jamaat. Jamaat means gathering. They are sitting inside of the mosque, they call my husband. They were all not at called me. They are calling my father or my brother. But what my father or brother talk about me, even they were talk about only my food and my dress, not my emotions. But they are asking everything from my husband. So without my statement, they pass the judgment. This is against of human rights violation. It is against of Quran in everything. So this is one thing. And second is, dowry is prohibited in Islam. Mahar is provided in, everybody knows what means dowry. Everybody knows. No? Dowry is prohibited in Islam. Mahar is provided. But what is happening in India, the men asking $10,000 as a dowry, giving $10 for mahar. This is very much commonly happening in India. These things are happening. Well, that's why what we thought, Jamaat means gathering. Okay, we try to sensitize the religious institution. When you dealing the whole community issue, you denied half of the community. Better you call us. Even we can wear 10 pardas also, we can, no problem. But they are not at all give any importance to us. That's why what we did, we tried to sensitize the Muslim women. Actually, in Indian Muslim, most of the women are reading Quran, only Arabic only, but they don't know what is in Quran. This is
Arifa,
the main.
could you speak a little slower for the translators? Just a little slower.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
So, how many minutes shall I take? 5 minutes or 10 minutes? Only okay. So okay, I will start. Okay. So what we did, we sensitized the Muslim women. We formed one Muslim women Jamaat. Anyhow, we are working on that. We are 25,000 members in the Jamaat. So okay, as per my 25 experience working this women, particularly Muslim women, there is no institution addressing Muslim women issues. Lot of Muslim institutions are there, but not for Muslim women issues. Actually, the Islam assure Muslim have more respect in their society more than other religious women. But today, the mobilizing of Muslim women curbed and they are suppressed at all levels. Not only the religious institution, other section also. Muslim men interpret religious tenets in the convenient manner to their advantage. So my strong recommendation to UN and Carter Center in other institutions to create a structured platform for Muslim men to express their grievance. We need special international Muslim women board, national level, state level, local level. So if we started the Muslim women board, will be assured Muslim women will get a new social space within the Muslim society. Number of one-sided drivers will be reduced. The political, economic, education empowerment and social empowerment of Muslim women would be developed. The bargaining capacity of the new world increase. Muslim women will be sensitized on their rights. The Muslim women would find a way of working existing legislation on their advantage and of articulating demand for new laws that are enacted in the spirit of willingness by women to report and address the issues of Muslim women in their respective countries. Apart from that, as a Muslim women, we are trying to construct the Muslim women mosque. It is processing now. In worldwide, we are seeking space and power for Muslim women. Please try to give us.
Thank you very much. So I think we've reached our time limit, and I know schedule is very important for making things flow. So we'll wrap it up here. And I think, a couple of things that we're going to keep in mind from this is the understanding of how we define religion and culture, and also the layers we peel back. And if at the very least, and I did purposely try to have most of the spiritual religious leaders speak more than the others. And the reason for that really is sometimes they don't put themselves, and I'm not saying that anybody's doing this by fault, but they don't always put themselves in the front of the conversation. And many times the activists, and those you know who you are the ones that take the mic and speak for both sides. And I say that lovingly because I try to straddle as much as I can all these spaces. So if we can take the time that you're having here otherwise to get to know each other at that level, and also encourage those religious leaders. I mean, it's unfortunate if somebody feels that they can't speak up and that they have been offended in some way, but also because they feel like their voice is not being heard, it's going to be an issue of concern. But at the very least, I know that religious leaders are our examples for humility, and are our examples for generosity, and are our examples for doing the right thing no matter what. So we treasure you as leaders, we treasure you as spiritual beacons for ourselves, and we treasure you for keeping us on the right track, not just religiously, but also, where our hearts are. So we hope we convey that to you. And for you to tell us what we need to do is something important for us to hopefully respond to. So with that, we'll go ahead and close and probably start up with the next panel, or turn it over to Karen.
I'd like to thank Afifa for moderating. It was wonderful. A very rich discussion. We'll be back in here at 4, and please be prompt, maybe 1 minute to 4, because President Carter will be in his chair early. And I just have one request. Please, when you're speaking, understand that we all want to hear you, what you're saying. And in order for everyone who has traveled here, who doesn't understand English, it's very important for the interpreters to have the time to hear what you're saying, to convey it adequately. So I'm just going to ask each of you to think about that as you're speaking in the final session. Thank you.